Masterpieces. As IGN celebrates its 30th anniversary, it's the perfect time to reflect on the past and celebrate the defining experiences that shaped gaming as we know it. Few genres have mutated and evolved and eviscerated players while doing so, quite like horror games have. It's a genre that has given us absolute classic franchises like Silent Hill, Castlevania, and Resident Evil, along with modern masterpieces like Dead Space, Bloodborne, and Mouthwashing. From humble and simplistic pixel art beginnings to the hyper-realistic, ultra-violent games of today, here are 30 horror game masterpieces and the dozens of horror games that inspired them and scared the hell out of us along the way. The earliest days of horror video games focused entirely on minimalist, creepy text-based adventures like Mystery House and Transylvania, the simple but effective maze-like Haunted House, or even the dread-inducing sci-fi arcade game Space Invaders, where waves of creatures would slowly descend upon the player's lone defenses against a deathly black screen. But 1987's Shadowgate was easily one of the most immersive early horror games, pairing a unique first-person perspective with a cryptic setting, great writing, and the kind of obtuse environmental puzzles that would eventually make their way into games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. ICOM Simulations, the original studio responsible for Shadowgate, went on to create the sequel Beyond Shadowgate and dabble in several other horror games, dipping into intellectual properties like Dracula and Are You Afraid of the Dark, before ultimately shuttering in 1997. Although the original Shadowgate was ported to the adorable little crank-driven handheld system, the Playdate, just last year, I love mine, it's not a modern franchise regularly getting new games like so many of the other entries on this list. Regardless, it will always be a masterpiece that helps set the stage for years of horror games to come. These days, modern gamers largely associate the Doom franchise with revolutionizing the first-person shooter genre and delivering tons and tons of ripping, tearing, and ass-kicking across several games in the decades since it first changed the world in 1993. But Doom's contributions to the horror genre are just as important, which makes sense considering the Alien and Evil Dead franchises were some of its biggest inspirations. Through its dank, dimly lit corridors filled with horrible, guttural sounds, players face zombified humans, cybernetic spider monsters, and flying demons from hell, all of which are very fitting for a game that kicks off with a chapter called Knee Deep in the Dead, a difficulty level that caps off at Nightmare, and a chainsaw-wielding protagonist who gets his face covered in blood when he dies. If that doesn't scream horror, man, I don't know what the fuck does. The franchise would go on to explore these themes repeatedly as it evolved, pushing and pulling its horror elements to balance them with its notoriously badass power fantasy vibes to varying degrees of success. 2004's Doom 3 took the series into some of its literal darkest settings yet, attempting to utilize shadows and jump scares in tight environments to elicit fear, while later titles retained the horrific creature design and cranked up violence from the original, but widened the level design and scale. Building off of the success of 1992's Wolfenstein 3D, Doom will always deserve its flowers for changing first-person gaming forever, but never forget what it did for horror too. Building off the story established in 1996's Clock Tower for the Super Famicom, the 1996 PSX sequel, Clock Tower, also known as Clock Tower 2 in Japan, took the 16-bit cryptic point-and-click adventure game and overhauled it with full 3D graphics, CD-quality voice acting and sound effects, and a deeper unraveling of its villain, Scissorman, leading to a truly unnerving experience. While horror games in this era may not have been intentionally sparse, Clock Tower's minimal use of a soundtrack meant that players would often go long stretches of time hearing only the echo of their own footsteps before the big and unexpected cinematic moments would sweep in to disarm them and make them jump off of their couches, or shit their pants, I guess. Clock Tower takes inspiration from classic Italian horror films like Suspiria and Phenomena, and follow a similar pace of dropping an unsuspecting female lead into an increasingly bizarre and dangerous world, but unlike a traditional horror movie, also gives players multiple endings to encounter across several storylines. The 1996 Clock Tower game went on to get several sequels and spiritual successors, but never really took off like its contemporaries for various reasons, the biggest of which was releasing just as another horror masterpiece had also just opened the door and entered the room.
Resident Evil.
It's a golden rule in horror that a creepy old mansion in the middle of nowhere is a top-tier setting for terror. Movies like 1963's The Haunting and 1980's The Changeling, please watch those movies, they're awesome, both knew that, as did games like 1987's Maniac Mansion, even if it leaned more on the side of the absurd, and Resident Evil producer Takuro Fujiwara's original horror game 1989's Sweet Home, a top-down precursor to the original Resident Evil in nearly every way. Old mansions are just scary. What's beyond that creaky door? What's that thumping sound in the attic? What's there lurking in the basement? Better hunt down a flashlight, some old keys, and see for ourselves if we want to figure out how to get out of here. You'll probably die. Resident Evil also took the lumbering, groaning hordes of the undead from the likes of George A. Romero's 1968 classic Night of the Living Dead and Lucio Fulci's 1979 cult hit Zombie, put them in a large and labyrinthine mansion-sized puzzle box, and sent you out to explore and survive the night, taking some of the best elements from early horror across every medium and making something new entirely. Cinematography isn't generally a word that video game geeks throw around to describe their favorite hobby like film buffs do, but Resident Evil's locked camera perspective and dynamic angles framing protagonists Chris and Jill in unique ways, often so you deliberately couldn't see what was lurking around the corner, had it in spades. Combined with clunky tank controls, limited weapons and healing items, a sparse, sinister soundtrack, campy voice acting, and good old-fashioned jump scares, Resident Evil instantly became one of the greatest horror games ever made when it launched in 1996. Capcom's stunning remake, released in 2002 for the GameCube, completely redid the graphics and added some deranged new story beats. Shout out to Lisa Trevor lurking in the basement, you terrify me, which only continued to exemplify Resident Evil's masterpiece status. 1992's Alone in the Dark originated many of the ingredients that made the Resident Evil gameplay so successful, and while Alone in the Dark never really took off on quite the same trajectory, the Resident Evil franchise continued to iterate, evolve, and even reinvent itself several times over for years to come. But hey, more on that in just a bit. Can you tell I want to talk more about Resident Evil? I will. While 1985's Ghosts and Goblins and 1986's Castlevania established that horror-themed side-scrolling platforming games could be both moody and brutally difficult, 1997's Castlevania Symphony of the Night set the bar higher than it ever had been before. Combining the non-linear progression of games like Castlevania 2 and Super Metroid, Symphony of the Night gave players a massive castle to explore, grind levels, and hunt vintage movie monsters like werewolves, sea monsters, and bats as they search for unique items that would allow them to reach new areas, battle brutal bosses, and ultimately work towards a surprise twist that literally turns the entire game on its head. Castlevania Symphony of the Night set the tone for many future 2D Castlevania games to come, including several similarly scoped games on the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS. They're all so good, while also going on to inspire an entire generation of Metroidvania games. There are horror games that revel in crippling the player's ability to fight back, forcing them to hide in fear and wait out the horrors that await. Then there's Castlevania, on the other hand, which is a power fantasy that constantly rewards inquisitive players with new weapons, armor, abilities, and summons as they rise in strength to take down Dracula once and for all, or at least until he returns in the next game.
You claim to love the darkness. Go then and dwell there for all eternity.
If you haven't put it together just yet, the PlayStation turned out to be an absolutely incredible proving ground for inventive horror games, and things got even better in 1999 when Silent Hill first arrived, a much more dynamic approach to the third-person action and puzzle format established in Resident Evil and Clock Tower. Using some clever hardware trickery, Konami obfuscated the PlayStation's draw distance limitations with fog and lighting techniques, which ended up playing to the genre's strengths, creating a moody and dreary world to explore. Silent Hill also tells a much sadder and more morose story than your usual survival horror game, awarding various good and bad endings depending on your actions, and it manages to do all this while introducing some of the most bizarre enemies ever seen in video games to date. The Silent Hill series continued to grow and mutate over the years, notably with an incredible sequel in 2001, along with several more experimental titles along the way, cementing it as one of the most important horror game franchises of all time. The unreliable narrator trope in fiction, making the audience view the story through the perspective of someone who may or may not be actually telling the truth, often leads to fascinating results and unforeseen twists. Movies like Rashomon, The Sixth Sense, and Memento all revel in distorting the audience's trust of the storyteller. Silicon Knights' revolutionary 2002 classic Eternal Darkness creates the same relationship between art and consumer, but uses it as an actual gameplay mechanic, forcing the player to control a protagonist who frequently goes temporarily insane and demands them to push through disturbing visions and horrific encounters that often aren't even actually happening, occasionally even breaking the fourth wall entirely. If surviving a creepy Rhode Island mansion packed with violent monsters while going slowly mad wasn't enough, Eternal Darkness also occasionally even pretends to shut your television off or infest your screen with bugs. At the time, it was nothing short of brilliant, and while numerous attempts were made to revitalize the IP and build a brand new game off of the original successes, none ever made it to the finish line, leaving the original as the one and only Eternal Darkness game left standing on its own forever. That's sad. They should make a new one. Come on. I know they tried, but try again. I want one. Wedged between the first and third Fatal Frame games, Crimson Butterfly is the clear survival horror standout of the trilogy, once again relying on a clever camera mechanic that allows players to both document and debilitate ghosts. It's a truly deeply scary experience where the player never really feels comfortable, nor should they be, in a village infested with all types of bleeding, deformed spirits. Compared to some of the more contemporary games on this list, the graphics and traversal can tend to feel a bit dated at times, but with a slick new remake running on a wholly new engine on the way this year, 2026 is the perfect time to bring the old ghost hunting camera back out for a fun night on the town. While 2000's Resident Evil Code Veronica took the original Resident Evil formula to brand new heights, 2005's Resident Evil 4 completely reinvented it, finding a new balance between action and horror that would be the recipe for the series for years to come. Classic Resident Evil hero Leon Kennedy is ripped out of an urban environment and thrown into the deep end of a rural folk horror setting teeming with murderous villagers. This yielded incredible results, and every other third-person action game immediately took notes. Resident Evil's gameplay, specifically its player movement, gunplay, and offensive and defensive moveset, changed the genre forever, as did its awesome set of upgradable weapons, unique side characters, giant set pieces, and over-the-top bosses. Plus, probably like the best merchant in video game history. What are you buying? But Resident Evil 4's real achievement is taking all those action movie-inspired elements and layering them into a gritty and atmospheric horror game. Wolves leap out at you from the night, chainsaw-wielding psychopaths decapitate you as blood showers down, and hordes of town people mob you with pitchforks and torches, hoping to tear you limb from limb. Sure, you've got a bigger arsenal than any Resident Evil game before it, but it doesn't mean you still won't die horrifically a bunch of times. Resident Evil 4 may have altered the franchise's DNA for good, and while older players may prefer its pure survival horror roots, it's undeniably one of the best video games ever made, a statement only made truer when you experience its excellent 2023 remake.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
While Resident Evil 4 terrified GameCube and PS2 players, Xbox 360 owners were treated to a very different horror game in 2005, Condemned: Criminal Origins, a brutal and crude first-person horror game about the hunt for serial killers across a sprawling urban setting. Little of the style and elegance of the typical first-person shooter are on display here. Guns are extremely limited in both usage and presence, forcing you to use found objects as blunt melee weapons and creating combat scenarios that feel extremely violent and personal. Between these brash and visceral life-or-death altercations, you'll need to find forensic clues to unravel the larger mystery and figure out exactly what is making everyone so psychotic. It's a foul, dirty-feeling gameplay experience that lingers long after the credits roll. It's certainly unique, although 2012's Zombie U managed to conjure a similar vibe of sinking a pipe-wielding player into a city gone mad. Fear Extraction Point, a standalone expansion to the original Fear game, successfully mixes fast-paced first-person shooting with a Matrix-style bullet time slowdown mechanic and a unique balance system that rewards you with faster movement if you holster your weapon, creating a fast-paced, risk-reward combat setting. It's a bit on the short side and reuses many of the original game's sounds and visuals, but manages to resurrect them in a smart, cohesive way to tell a singular horror story that plays differently than practically every other game on this list. While many horror games opt to go in guns blazing, Siren Blood Curse closes out the excellent Siren trilogy with deeply satisfying stealth mechanics that let you silently creep across an ominous and distressing sepia-toned Japanese village. It's a tense and harrowing experience with limited offensive abilities, and that often leaves players waiting in the shadows as a nearby enemy passes by with only the sound of their own increasing heart rate to accompany them. Also home to some of the most horrific looking creature designs that feel lifted straight from a Junji Ito drawing, and seeing them leap from the shadows never stops being utterly terrifying. Ridley Scott's 1979 film Alien proved that pitting regular workers against a hulking, nasty creature in a derelict spaceship was the perfect concoction for sci-fi horror, and 2008's Dead Space totally received the message loud and clear, pitting engineer Isaac Clarke against some of the grossest looking aliens you've ever seen while armed with little more than some rusty mining tools. Using a genius combat system that allowed players to target and dismember individual body parts, severing limbs and heads to the sounds of growling screams and fountains of blood, along with some great third-person gameplay inspired by the likes of Resident Evil 4, Dead Space took survival horror games to bold new heights, and that's even before the anti-gravity sequences kick in. Later sequels, Dead Space 2 and 3, along with the spiritual successor, the Callisto Protocol, revisited this same thesis, as did the fantastic Dead Space remake in 2023, although the future of the franchise feels uncertain at the moment. Until it returns though, the first game is always worth a playthrough no matter which version you decide to experience. Returning to video games' horror adventure game roots, 2010's Amnesia: The Dark Descent also relies on its own twist on a sanity meter, this time tethering it to the darkness, or more specifically, how much time you opt to dwell in it. Throw in some vintage H.P. Lovecraft inspiration and a big spooky castle trapping a character who, you guess it, can't remember why they're there, and you've got a modern classic indie horror game that managed to connect deeply with tons of players thanks largely to its unique physics-based puzzles and unforgettable story moments that culminate in big, satisfying ways. There's an argument to be made that Amnesia: The Dark Descent might just be the scariest video game ever made, even if you don't scare easily. 2014's The Evil Within brings Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami back to his roots after he started to realize that survival horror games had begun to take a backseat to action horror. It feels equal parts classic Resident Evil and the Saw film franchise, with a couple of dashes of things like 2003's Manhunt thrown in, like a nice stab in the gut. It's a harrowing and deranged experience riddled with death traps, tortured, violent enemies, and general hopelessness that pervades its overall tone, while still feeling like the natural maturation of the classic video game survival horror formula, right down to its safe rooms where players can briefly disconnect from getting hacked at by blunt objects during a psychotic hallucination. It also includes an incredibly clever mechanic where downed enemies can come back to life unless they're burned to ashes with a match, a resource that's just as hard to come by as bullets and healing items. Like many classic horror films, the plot tends to take a backseat to the gore, kills, and general creepy ambience, but the overall experience feels so cohesively horror that ultimately it never really gets dragged down by its faults. The studio followed things up with the equally successful The Evil Within 2 in 2017, as well as the open-world first-person horror action game Ghostwire Tokyo in 2020. In 2024, Shinji Mikami announced he was starting a new studio that will sadly move its focus away from horror games, which is definitely a bummer for many, but hey, that guy is a legend responsible for some of the most incredible games ever made, so as long as he's making new ones, I'll be happy, even if they aren't designed specifically to entertain weirdos like me who like spooky, scary shit. Hot off the heels of 2013's tremendously successful first-person survival hit Outlast, a game that basically reworked the rules for first-person survival horror, Sega and Creative Assembly teamed up to release Alien Isolation, a game that took classic cat and mouse hide-and-seek themes and dropped them into the world of Alien films. Alien Isolation pits Amanda Ripley, the daughter of the original film's protagonist, Ellen Ripley, against a quick-moving, unpredictable, and utterly vicious xenomorph in a painstakingly recreated vintage spaceship, and the vibes, as the kids say, are immaculate. Throughout the experience, the xenomorph's artificial intelligence seems to constantly learn new tricks, tracking your patterns to quite literally rip you out of your comfort zone and eviscerate you. It's not perfect, as one of the game's original writers admits that the game goes on a tad too long and that its runtime could have benefited from being cut down a bit, a sentiment many critics were saying at the time, but it's such a mechanically and visually engrossing experience as a whole that it doesn't really matter. And sure, it's absolutely scary as hell, but it's also such a total delight to be basking in this world if you're a fan of the original Alien films, because the team put so much love into painstakingly recreating so much about what made them so cool, even if you have a pretty good chance of getting stabbed by a huge alien tail if you stand around gawking at the gorgeous ship interior details for too long. I know I have. Creative Assembly has announced that a new Alien Isolation game is in early stages of development, so hopefully it won't be too long until we get to return to that special corner of space where no one can hear you scream. If you grew up in the 80s and 90s, there was a strong chance that one of your friends would invite you to a birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese, a glorified arcade casino that featured skee ball, rubbery pizza, and the world's dirtiest ball pit full of sunken treasures like lost bouncy balls, someone's missing left sock, and a dental retainer. And somehow, those weren't even the scariest things in that place. Back in the party room, a bug-eyed animatronic band sang songs and made crude, jerky movements behind fake instruments until the previously mentioned rubber pizza was served, in which the band and the spotlights above them would shut down, cease movement, and watch ominously over you as you ate, like this. Terrifying. Basically nightmare fuel for any kid just trying to win enough arcade tickets to get a crappy prize, like the parachute guy that always got stuck in a tree. Decades later, in 2014, developer Scott Cawthorne realized that this was the perfect setting for a modern horror game where he could introduce a whole new generation to the Chuck E. Cheese backrooms, and Five Nights at Freddy's was born. Five Nights at Freddy's turns the original setting's inspiration to a point-and-click adventure game featuring a lonely night guard tasked with watching over the restaurant once the customers are all gone. Only now, the animatronics are psychotic murderers that can't wait to jump scare you and kill you. What specifically kicks ass about these games is that younger audiences who are generally shut out from the more violent and mature video games in the genre latched onto them quickly and made them a global hit, creating a whole new generation of horror fans in the process. Five Nights spawned several sequels and theatrically released films, and while the actual Chuck E. Cheese restaurants still exist in sad, dwindling numbers across America, it's safe to say that Freddy's has surpassed Chuck E. Cheese in pop culture popularity and propensity to scare children everywhere. Ooh, now I get to talk about Bloodborne. While 2009's Demon's Souls and 2011's Dark Souls had plenty of horror elements, FromSoft's living nightmare masterpiece Bloodborne took all the punishingly hardcore gameplay they were known for from previous Souls games and dropped them into their most sinister world yet. Bloodborne's plagued city of Yharnam is entirely out to kill you, from brutal environmental hazards to its rogues gallery of gnarled monsters lashing out at you from the darkness. But underneath its oppressive and dimly lit themes of evil monstrosity is a fast-paced, immensely satisfying action RPG with some of the best and most varied combat in the genre. Yes, Bloodborne and its masterfully created army of creatures will kill you over and over again, but every time you succeed in inching closer to its next shortcut, or taking down one of its many towering beasts with only a speck of your life remaining, you'll leap off the couch, jumping for joy and screaming in victory. There's a deep, complex story tying Bloodborne together, one that fans have been interpreting in unique ways for over a decade now. Every inch of its dilapidated cobblestone streets, decrepit and barren countrysides, sunken, rotting alleyways, and impossibly magnificent castles feels packed with life and lore, with a beautiful and haunting orchestral score swelling over it all. FromSoft went on to revisit similar feelings later in the excellent grim fantasy-inspired games Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, but nothing has nailed horror as well as Bloodborne has. Seriously, remaster it, remake it, just make it. Do more Bloodborne. Make more Bloodborne for me. For there's dozens of us, a couple million of us, a lot of us. Make more Bloodborne. An underwater ocean facility is a death trap for humans. The masterfully dystopian BioShock taught us that in 2007 with its sunken city of Rapture gone to hell, and in 2015 frictional game Soma once again plunges its players into the depths of madness beneath the ocean's dark and treacherous waves.
Please don't let me die. Nothing is about to die.
Soma opts to make the player largely powerless against its wild array of both mechanical and organic enemies trudging around a sunken research center on the ocean floor, focusing more on survival as story beats are doled out piecemeal, little by little. It's only when learning that things might not be exactly much better up there on land do things really start to congeal and become truly hopeless. In 2012, Telltale's The Walking Dead broke the mold for narrative-driven video games by presenting a series of connected, episodic stories that ebbed and flowed based on the personal decisions made by the player. It took the deliberate construction of a great TV show, mixed it with the creative autonomy of a great video game, and resulted in a wholly unique creation that felt both personal and powerful. I still cry about that ending. It was the natural extension of games like 2010's Heavy Rain, a pulpy serial killer story that played out differently depending on your choices, leading to a variety of good, bad, and really bad endings. In 2015, Supermassive Games revisited the concept with Until Dawn, this time leaning on the classic young adults go somewhere they're not supposed to be and start getting killed off one by one movie trope, while integrating the branching narrative functionality that only the medium of video games can offer. Dawn throws together a ton of great slasher film tropes into an experience that works really well as a single-player game, and even better with a group of real-life friends huddled around a television frantically shouting their personal decisions before watching characters die in violent and absurd ways. It's an utter blast to replay over and over again, watching individual story beats play out differently, seeing how sparing a specific character from death might lead to another dying an even worse one, and so on. Until Dawn went on to get a prequel, a remake, a spiritual successor, and a film adaptation, so it's clearly a concept with some life left in it, even if its protagonists rarely get to share the same fate. Mechanically, Playdead's 2016 classic Inside took much of what made their previous hit Limbo work so well and improved upon it in just about every way. Inside is once again a largely monochrome platforming game starring an emotionless little boy who will suddenly and frequently die to various environmental horrors in brutal and violent ways, slowly peeling back the layers of the world's bigger picture if he manages to survive the night. It's a far cry from the colorful hop and bop side-scrolling games that came before it, but that's precisely why it works so well. There are no walls of text to parse through, no voiceover cutscenes, just a sad, morose, minimalist story drip-fed through simplistic imagery and a subtle but profound music score that has more in common with an industrial engine room than a Koji Kondo soundtrack. And, like Limbo, it's the kind of experience that begs to be unpacked and dissected through numerous interpretations long after the credits roll. Playdead is currently working on an unnamed third title that clearly takes visual cues from their previous games, and the sooner we learn more about that, the better. As you probably picked up on by now, despite horror being a genre so perfectly suited to experiencing alone in the dark, it scales really well with friends too. And while watching a scary movie with others is great, it's even more fun when you know one of them is a killer hunting down the rest of you. That's why 2016's Dead by Daylight works so well, a brilliant, fast-paced, asymmetrical horror game where one players take on the role of a violent murderer while the rest try to team up to survive or just scramble separately into the night where they'll typically get picked off one by one. Like many popular online multiplayer games such as Fortnite and Call of Duty, Dead by Daylight eventually became defined by its numerous collaborations with other intellectual properties and brands, but being a horror game allowed it to introduce all sorts of licensed monsters from both movie and TV to join its roster of cunning and savage killers. Everyone from Freddy Krueger to Ghostface to even Chucky eventually made their way to the game, turning Dead by Daylight into a massive celebration of genre icons. For a kid with a vivid imagination, every dark corner of the bedroom hides a horror. There's a monster under the bed, a creature in the closet, and the shadow of a hanging lamp behind a flickering light bulb is really a 6-foot-tall venomous tarantula waiting to devour them, at least until the screams begin and their parents run in to tell them to go back to sleep because it's all in their head. Can you tell I'm a dad? 2017's Little Nightmares builds on this idea, grabbing the iconic yellow raincoat from Stephen King's It and putting its young protagonist in a house of horrors that feels like playing hide and seek in a Tim Burton sketchbook. It mixes some truly fun monster designs with some occasionally frustrating game design decisions, but it ultimately balances it all out to become a special puzzle platforming horror game. In fact, the premise was so solid that Little Nightmares went on to become a full trilogy of games leading up to Tarsier Studios' latest ambitious horror game, Reanimal. 2014's groundbreaking horror experience PT, aka Playable Teaser, brought together the minds of Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro for a claustrophobic, looping horror experience filled with a horrifying surprise at every turn. Originally intended to be a lead-up to a full-fledged modern reboot of the classic Silent Hill franchise, the universe, or Konami specifically at the time, got in the way and the game was cancelled. PT was delisted and all parties went their separate ways, leaving a gigantic what-if situation for gamers to sink into forever. It's a bummer of a situation as the potential of a collaboration between two creative geniuses seemed limitless, but on a more positive note, Kojima is working on a new horror game, Del Toro keeps making great horror movies, and in 2020, the talented folks at Sad Square Studios launched Visage, an excellent spiritual successor to PT, so hey, not all is lost. Visage revisits a similar premise as PT, trapping the player in a haunted house, tormenting them and slowly chipping away at their sanity as they explore and try to get to the bottom of exactly what went down to make the place so evil. It's a genuinely unnerving experience, repeatedly succeeding in catching the player off guard in bold and scary ways, largely due to the way each room feels natural, lived in, and deliberately staged. You rapidly begin to feel like the house is a real place where really bad things happened, and sure, it sucks that we never got the true follow-up to PT, but its potential lives on in the indie horror game scene, so hey, we'll take it. "2012's Resident Evil 6 was both critically divisive and failed to reach internal sales goals, leading to Capcom using it as an opportunity to put the brakes on the numbered Resident Evil games for a bit and come up with a brand new plan for the franchise. The result was a brilliant two-pronged attack led by Resident Evil 7 in 2017, a taut first-person game that traded over-the-top action for tense survival horror, and quickly followed by a full-on remake of the 1998 classic Resident Evil 2. But unlike Capcom's previous Resident Evil remake, 2019's Resident Evil 2 ditched the tank controls and fixed camera angles and instead gave players full fluid control of movement and aiming.
What the hell is up with you?
The result was an absolute masterpiece and proof that Capcom could take a decades-old game and make it feel both novel and nostalgic, honoring the original for older fans while modernizing the formula for newer ones. And while 2020's remake of 1999's Resident Evil 3 missed the mark a bit and felt like a slight step backwards, 2023's remake of Resident Evil 4 picked things right back up and is largely regarded as one of the best video game remakes of all time. Overlapping with these releases was the excellent Resident Evil Village, and now 2026's Resident Evil Requiem, a game that utilizes its two main characters to give players both the survival horror and action combat experiences that Resident Evil has been known for decades, all while allowing players to switch between first and third person perspectives. None of these achievements would have been possible without Resident Evil 2 and the remake, and Capcom's willingness to go back to its roots while also future-proofing the series. It's so exciting to think that after 30 years, the legendary horror game franchise Resident Evil might only just be getting started. While the Resident Evil franchise continues to thrive by incorporating first-person horror in the mainline games, indie games have their own successes in the same space, doing groundbreaking and terrifying things with that perspective. Phasmophobia is a brilliant ghost hunting simulator that can be played either solo or with friends, providing a deeply unnerving experience either way. Like the best indie horror games, combat is significantly de-emphasized here in favor of survival, but unlike games that expect you to hide and wait out the night, Phasmophobia's focus on paranormal investigation means you're forced to head deeper and deeper into its world to document everything you see, and man, you will see some shit. As is the case in the previously mentioned Eternal Darkness, your character's sanity meter is actively hindered by the ghosts you witness or interact with. This formula turned out to be a smash hit with the streaming crowd, as it turns out the only thing more fun than watching one player suffer in fear is watching a group of friends go through hell together.
This is starting to freak me out!
I have to regroup! Get back together right now! It's hunting us!
13 years after the original Alan Wake and 4 years after the monumental and subversive action game Control, the folks at Remedy Interactive released Alan Wake 2, a stunning, haunting psychological horror game that blends two different protagonist stories together to create one of the most unique horror game experiences of all time. At first glance, Alan Wake 2 might seem like your standard issue third-person action horror game, but things very quickly go completely off the rails, and the experience becomes one of the least predictable horror game stories of all time. A pretty stunning achievement considering how deep the genre had run by the time of its release. It's also one of the best-looking games ever made, thriving for photorealism in everything from its foliage to its facial hair. Possibly its most interesting achievement is the way it balances gritty and harrowing murder investigation with insane Twin Peaks absurdity, hitting comedy high notes just as well as it hits the horror ones.
You left us on quite the cliffhanger. We've all been dying to know what "it's not a lake, it's an ocean" really means.
But hey, who says you need cutting-edge visuals and graphical fidelity to sell a great horror game? There's something spectacularly creepy about lo-fi aesthetic, fuzzy textures, warbled sound effects, and weird, obtuse characters. After all, that's the backbone of so many early horror games built around hardware and technology limitations, creating a look and feel that seemed mind-blowing at the time, felt dated years later, and now has looped back around to being a specific style that people are genuinely nostalgic for. 2022's Signalis understood the assignment when it smartly used beefed-up PS1 era graphics to tell a modern sci-fi horror story, and 2024's bleak and violent mouthwashing took things even further while stripping back the gameplay mechanics to a bare minimum, focusing on exploration and limited interactivity in a derelict ship lost in space, weaving together stories from both before and after the crash to feed players a delirious double-crossing horror story where no one can be trusted and things just keep getting more and more insane. Developed by Bloober Team, a studio that cut their chops with horror games like 2016's Layers of Fear and 2019's Blair Witch Project, inspired by the films of the same name, 2024's Silent Hill Remake presented a modern recreation of a classic survival horror game just as Capcom did when they revisited Resident Evil 2, ditching locked camera angles and low-poly models for a full-on third-person experience complete with gorgeous new graphics. The Silent Hill 2 remake is a triumph, successfully carrying over all of the mood, tone, and despair of the original game, judiciously deciding when to contract and expand on moments and themes of the 2001 game, resulting in an experience that both honors it and occasionally even exceeds it. A year later, in 2025, Konami published the excellent spin-off Silent Hill F, so despite the publisher having fumbled the series previously, it feels like things might finally be on track for gamers to get great new Silent Hill games for years to come.
I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
Yeah, I'm looking for Silent Hill.
30 horror game masterpieces that changed the world of gaming as we know it and paved the way for the genre to grow, evolve, shock, and kill excited players for decades to come. And with big 2026 horror games like Resident Evil Requiem, Reanimal, Halloween, and more on the way, things are only just getting started. There's really nothing quite like a great horror game, so let us know your favorite horror game experiences in the comments below. I tried to shout out as many as I could. Obviously, I missed dozens of them. Tell me your favorites. As always, thanks for rocking with IGN since 1996. Like, you rule. That's awesome. And for all things video games, spooky, scary, stabby, or otherwise, stick with IGN.